Today I'm going to be continuing my series on the 5 worst ideas or worst applications of technology on the Corvette. Last video we talked about the low points on the C4. Today I'm going to cover the C5 and the C6 together. Not because they don't each have their own foibles, they do, but that a lot of them are shared because under the skin the cars are very, very similar. To be clear, you know I love the C5 and the C6, okay? This is not beating up on those cars. They are still the best bargain for the performance, the look, the feel, and the joy of any other car on the planet for what they can do. But there are certain things that either could have been done better engineering-wise or maybe just haven't aged very well over time and are now in playing armchair quarterback, not looking the best anymore. So I got 5 of them and I got a couple of runners-up that we'll cover. Before we get started, if you would take a moment to like, subscribe, share, do all the things down here. I know I sound like a broken record asking every week, but it really does help the channel and I truly do appreciate it when any of you can help me out that way. That said, let's get into today's topic. Steve and I discussed this. The top 5 things that we really kind of don't like about the way they put together the C5 and the C6 are, number 1, especially on the C5, the location of the battery in relation to the engine management computer, the throttle actuation controller, the main wiring harness, the main junction, the main ground. Basically, long story short, and I'm sure if you've played with your C5 at all and taken your battery out and looked down, you're like, oof, that looks like a lot of expensive, really intricate stuff down there under the battery, the acid-filled battery. And you're right, it is. And there was a lot of people over the last 25 years who have had problems because their battery expanded, cracked, leaked, and then battery acid ran down and ate up their wiring connections, killed their engine computer, heck, sometimes even rusts through that part of the frame, and that will kill a car. That will make a car unfixable. So why they couldn't have found somewhere else to either put the battery, like in the rear, like they did later on the C6, because, well, I'm sure they had their reasons and their production parameters and things were already made and finalized and in motion while they were still kind of hashing this thing out. So I get it, but that is probably the worst thing, number 1, in the C5 specifically, is that you're constantly worried about having your battery explode and leak down on your stuff. It is rarer today, especially if you're using good like interstate batteries that I always use here and recommend, and you just check them regularly to make sure the sides aren't pooching out. The odds of you having a battery acid leak onto vital components of your electronics are fairly small, but still it is not the best design. One of those where you're like, you'd like to just go ask the engineer, so what were you thinking here? Number 2. On the C5 and the C6 in manual shifting cars, there's absolutely no easy way to bleed the clutch. Now on a C4, it takes 3 guys to do it. You can bleed the clutch, you can bleed the slave cylinder, you can bleed the master, and boop, 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 Bob's your uncle, you're done. On the C5 and the C6, because of where the slave cylinder is located, you know, you've heard me talk about the torque tube before, that sealed drive shaft unit that runs between the engine and the transmission. Well, that's all one big welded together aluminum tube that all of this stuff runs inside. And at the very front of that torque tube, where the shaft is going through the clutch and into the back of the motor, the slave cylinder is right there wrapped around that shaft. And there is no way to easily bleed that. There's no access to it when the car is together. So, you know, today's answer to that, and we always do it when we do a clutch job, is they have very nice remote bleeders that while you have the car apart, you install that on the slave cylinder before you put the slave cylinder on the torque tube and put the torque tube in the car. And then that comes up and you have a little bleeder that hangs out right here next to your clutch reservoir under the hood. That makes bleeding the clutch so easy. But guys, these were performance-oriented cars. There hadn't been a more performance-oriented Corvette than the C5 yet, I swear to you. And the fact that they didn't think about that, it was like, what are you doing? Why would you not allow me a way, even allow yourselves when you were working on these cars under warranty to have a way to bleed that out so you didn't have to tear the car apart and fix it? So just short-sighted. Number 3, in a similar fashion, there's no way to check the transmission fluid. None. Well, there is a way to check the transmission fluid. In order to check the automatic transmission fluid level, you have to get the car up to temperature, put it on the lift, take the plug off of the fill on the side of the pan, and if it burps hot fluid all over your face, level's good. Legitimately, that's how you figure it out. Oh yeah, we're fine, we're fine. That's terrible. Now, if this car was designed and engineered in Germany, here's what would have happened. In that big flat back area where you put your groceries and your luggage and all that stuff, there would have been a concealed door that you could open up, and under there would have been access to a dipstick that you could get to check your transmission fluid level, color, condition. And it would have been elaborate, needlessly so, and terribly expensive to replace if it ever broke because it's German. But you would have had access to it. Again, just like the clutch slave, the position and the engineering of it, it was one of those things that was kind of like, huh, yeah, I guess we forgot to do that. Well, too late now. It's very difficult to properly maintain fluid levels unless you have a lift and you know what you're doing. And it was a lot easier just to have a dipstick and go, yeah, that's good. So not a fan of that on the C5 or the C6. Item number 4. Brakes are too small and too feeble for those cars. Now, I'm not talking about the Z51, the Z06, the Grand Sport, the ZR1 in the C6 run, because they did get the 6-piston calipers up front, 4 pistons out back, and those were beefy brakes. But specifically the C5, specifically the C5 Z06, for what those cars were capable of, the brakes that were put on it from the factory were acceptable for driving it like you drive a Camry, or like you drive a Taurus, or like you drive a Range Rover, but they weren't in any way, shape, or form up to the task for track days, autocrossing, actual extended sporting driving. The compounds that they chose for the brakes, the size of the brakes, the materials used in the rotors, none of those are up to the task for if you're going to do any kind of extended sporting driving. You want to go do a track day at Sebring for 4 hours on Saturday, 4 hours on Sunday, you better bring 2 sets of brakes, okay? Because you're not going to get through day 1 if you don't have at least upgraded pads and upgraded rotors. You can still get by with the calipers. They're not ideal, but as long as you have stuff that can deal with the temperatures and the stresses of track work, they'll be okay. But the stock stuff, absolutely not. And what was disappointing about that is that the cars were so capable and lent themselves so well to that kind of enjoyment that it kind of sucked that you had to go through the expense of upgrading them just to use them in a way for which they were born to be used, right? I go back to Porsche. Yes, Porsche is much more expensive. Yes. But when you buy a Porsche, you could take that Porsche from the showroom to Sebring, and everything is designed to work on the track just like it works on the road. American cars, really, even our top of the line American sports cars, until very recently hadn't gotten to that point. And so I just wish they had discovered that investing in better materials on those things and raising the price of the car by $500 or $1,000 wouldn't have hurt them and would have been better for the car and the ownership experience in the sporting realm long term. Item number 5. C5 interior bits. Now, the C5 interior and its quality or lack thereof has been done to death on YouTube, online, everything. I'm not going to go into a bunch of it. What was disappointing wasn't necessarily the fitment, wasn't necessarily the quality. It was some of the things that just lacked any kind of actual forethought and to what's this car going to be like in 3 years, 4 years. And I know that the manufacturers are concerned with the car during its warranty period, and after that they will support it, but they don't necessarily worry about, are these people still happy with their car, because they really hope maybe you're not, so you buy the newer version of that car. Things like the sun visors, which anybody who watches my channel here knows what I think about those sun visors and why they were terrible. I mean, really, cardboard. Things like the seat structures, okay? Now, we can all talk about how the seats are unsupportive and they don't hold you in your place, this, that, and the other, but the seats were, especially the seat backs, okay, the uprights that your back goes against, they were just very thin fiberglass, unsupported, easy for me to say, by anything else. And they, even when they were new, they were breaking, especially under hard driving, hard braking, anything like that. It was just not done. I know it was done with budget being the most important part, but still for America's supercar, it should have been done better. And that hasn't aged well, especially when looking at what they were able to do with the C7 and the C8. Those seats are amazing. They look amazing. They feel amazing. They are extremely well built. C5 and C6, they really never got, the last 2 years of C6, they improved the seats a little bit, but they were still never anything great. It should have been better. Okay, so that's the top 5 things that we figured were the most annoying. Here are some of the runners-up. The heads-up displays in both C5 and C6. I like them. In fact, once you have a heads-up display and you get used to it, if you don't have it, you really miss it. The problem is, when they break, there's no way to access them without pulling the entire dash out of the car to then take the unit out, put it on your bench, fix it, put it back, and then have to put the dash entirely back in again. I would have loved to have seen, they had a hole in the top of the dash, and there's that plastic bezel that goes over it. Why didn't they engineer it so that you could remove either just part of the dash or remove that bezel and make it larger, different shaped, whatever, and be able to access that unit without having to pull the entire dash? Because it just really hurts the feasibility of doing a simple, weekend repair rebuild on your HUD if you're mildly mechanically inclined, rather than yanking the entire dash out of the car. Another runner-up was in the 2005 Corvette specifically, and specifically with the manual transmission. I'm sure you've all heard, and if you have an 05, you know, when you park that car and leave it, you got to make sure it is in reverse when you shut the car down, because if you don't, it'll drain the battery. How did they not figure out this was a bad idea during the development of that car? I guarantee they parked that car more than once during its development, and nobody ever thought, hey, this could be a problem moving forward. They clearly discovered it was a problem because it was changed in 06 and you didn't have to do it. But why was it even allowed out that way? It's just like, guys, come on, this is the car we love. Can you please just love it half as much as we do? Please. And finally, third runner-up, CAGS. For those of you who don't know what CAGS is, CAGS, Computer Assisted Gear Selection, also with the manual transmission. Okay, so the idea behind CAGS, I've talked about it before on some of my other videos, was that at low RPMs, when you just kind of putter away from a light in your six speed, and you go to shift to second, if the RPMs aren't high enough and the speed isn't high enough, the computer will aggressively force you to shift to fourth gear instead of second gear in order to save fuel. The problem is, when you're puttering away from a light and you're at low RPMs and you go from first gear to fourth gear, it bogs the engine down and it just doesn't feel sporting, it doesn't sound good, it doesn't feel good. And it just, on a sports car, this was not the way you wanted to eke an extra 0.16 mpg out of the car. Thankfully, there's an inexpensive solution to eliminating that, to where you can shift first, second, third, fourth all you want and never have to deal with it again. It's like $29. It's called the CAGS Eliminator. But this is another one of those things that was clearly designed by committee, and car guys were clearly out to lunch or not allowed in the room when they decided that was a good idea. So, as much as we love the C5 and the C6, they aren't perfect, and these are some of the little things about them that we wish they had done differently if they could have. That's pretty much it for today's video, guys. I'll be back with another video in a couple of days, and we'll be covering something else new and interesting. Thank you so much for watching.